Thanks for joining us on the Inside Method podcast. Today we're talking about generative AI in healthcare. My name is Scott Pope. I'm the global lead for healthcare and life sciences here at Method. And we've got an outstanding lineup of panelists today to lead us through a conversation on generative AI in healthcare. Before we jump in and allow my guests to introduce themselves, Andy Busam and Gareth Jones, we're going to, this topic of generative AI in healthcare is, we've really hit a tipping point here recently where it is absolutely the talk of the town, if you will. We're going to do a little bit of context setting, but there's kind of three main things that we're going to talk about as it relates to the topic today. One, we're going to talk about some real life examples of things that we're seeing with AI and generative AI in healthcare. We're going to cover some specific nuances relative to healthcare above and beyond what we see in other industries like retail and consumer and banking. And then specific to the white paper or perspective paper that my panelists have written, we're going to get into some of the perspectives and viewpoints that they've shared relative to how Method is approaching AI in healthcare. So with that, it's my privilege to welcome Andy Busam here in the room with me and Gareth Jones all the way across the pond in the UK. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, Scott. It's great to be here.
Thank you for having us.
So for our listeners, if you guys could please give a little bit of introductions to yourself. Andy, since you're here in the room, I'll let you kick us off.
Sure thing. Thanks, Scott. As you mentioned, my name is Andy Busam. I'm a principal strategist here at Method. I've been with the firm for around 4 or 5 years. I've spent time working across our portfolio of business, across a range of clients, but most recently focused on our healthcare clients. And do have a background working within health systems, but also in the pharmaceutical industry. And most recently, within the past year or so, really digging into our data practice with Gareth, as well as our colleagues at Global Logic around AI, as well as generative AI, and particularly excited about the application of those technologies within healthcare.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks so much for being here, Andy. Gareth, would you introduce yourself to our listeners, please?
Yeah, thank you, Scott. My name is Gareth Jones. I'm a data designer based at Method's London office. So I completed my PhD in the application of machine learning classifiers to arterial disease detection. The focus of my research was really to look at if we could use machine learning to detect consistent and significant biomarkers of arterial disease within easily obtainable peripheral measurements of blood pressure and flow rate. I then went on to help develop computer vision models that could detect early signs of coronary artery disease in CT scans. Since working for Method, I've spent a lot of time looking into how we balance information with comprehension when using data-driven insights and tools to help clinical decision makers.
So Dr. Jones, thank you so much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to have you on here all the way across the pond there in the UK. So real quick context setting, the adoption of new technology in healthcare isn't really a novel concept, right? We've been adopting new technologies, everything from penicillin to transplants to you name it. There's a ton of new technology that gets adopted in healthcare on a regular basis. Set a little more context for us, Andy, in terms of how you see this really fitting into place, AI adoption in healthcare.
Sure. You're right, Scott. Technology progression within the healthcare space is certainly nothing new. I think we can go as far back to the 1950s to see some of the earlier applications of data science applied within the healthcare space. And the progression of that has grown exponentially, especially since the 2000s and within the last decade or so. I would actually love to hear Gareth's perspective on this, just given the academic research as well as the practical and professional research that you've done within the space and what you've seen grow technologically within healthcare.
I think healthcare has always kept up really well with progressions in machine learning and AI. Academically, there's been massive strides over the last, as you say, 20 years, 30 years-ish. And generally, healthcare has utilized that. My background is in creating computer vision models, right? So at the same time, there's again a lot of press elsewhere, like self-driving cars. Healthcare is also utilizing it to its full potential. So I don't think it's necessarily an industry that's lagged. I think there's a lot more that could be done. However, it's not as if it's far behind either.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And I think that what we're seeing now is an increasing number of challenges facing the healthcare industry at large, and these technologies as a potential solution to help solve those. A couple of the statistics that really stood out to me recently doing some research were that 50% of errors within the documentation space within healthcare are from administrative reasons. The cost from discovery to drug development within the pharmaceutical space, average right now is about $1.8 billion. So if you think about some of these challenges that exist, the amount of money that's being spent, the amount of time that's being spent on delivering care to patients, the number of errors that happen as a result of of human manual process in the mix, I think that these technologies have a real opportunity to help us deliver better patient outcomes.
Yeah. And that's a great lead into some of the things that we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail here as we move forward. One of the interesting pieces that you guys talk about a little bit in that perspective paper is the difference between just traditional artificial intelligence and generative artificial intelligence. You guys can choose who wants to tackle that one, but help our listeners understand kind of that core concept.
Yeah, as someone with not the robust background as Gareth, my layman's term here, or layman's definition for the shift that's happened, is that artificial intelligence helps us synthesize and analyze data. Generative AI can actually create or generate as a result of analyzing that data.
Okay.
So I think that what we're seeing in the space is a new capability as a result of generative AI, and not just the ability to analyze, synthesize, and present insights. But Gareth, would you mind sort of unpacking that a bit more?
Yeah, I think you covered it really well. When we talk about machine learning and artificial intelligence, we primarily think about either descriptive or prescriptive. So descriptive being like, we have data there, what can we extract from it? Prescriptive being like, how can we draw out insights that may not immediately be accessible from that data? But in both of these cases, users have this really clear, here's the start data, here's the end insights. And although that middle piece might be a little bit missing, they can kind of see the two bookends on it. Where I feel like generative AI differentiates from that is that starting point is a little bit more opaque, because we are creating something entirely net new. And so it's a little bit slower to build adoption and trust, because we can't necessarily see, hey, look, here is some data and here's my outcomes. Although we have those prompts, or we have something that actually triggers that generative AI, how that has come to the output is a little bit different, and it's a bit more abstract for clinicians, I think. So I think that's where we really start to differentiate, as you say, is we are now actually producing something new rather than just mining available data for what might be in there.
Gareth, you touched on a really important term there with trust that we're gonna unpack a little bit more greater detail here as we move forward in the conversation too. So the two of you wrote a perspective paper on generative AI in healthcare that I had the privilege of getting a pre-read on. Our listeners can download that at method.com/insights. Depending on when they're listening to this publication of the podcast, it may be out, it may still be final steps of production there, but method.com/insights for that, your perspective paper on generative AI in healthcare. There, as you guys talk about in that paper, there's already deployments of AI in healthcare. This is, as you've kind of both alluded to, it's not necessarily anything new. I think it's certainly more in the spotlight recently than it has been. But give me just one or two examples of where you've kind of seen AI being utilized in the current healthcare setting. Some of those companies that you see that are really good examples that jump out for our listeners to understand how it's being deployed. Sure.
I think that one particular area that we've seen a couple of companies jump into because of its potential is around essentially ambient audio recording conversations between providers and patients. And so just to list a couple of companies here, Abridge is a startup in this space. Nuance, which is a Microsoft subsidiary.
It's been around for a long time.
Absolutely. And Amazon has just launched a new product as well in this space, all sort of doing the same thing. But essentially what this use case or application does is it records the audio in a room between a provider and a patient. It's secure and encrypted, of course, and it transcribes that audio. And it sends a copy of that into the EMR as well as to the patient via a mobile app. In Abridge's case, I can't speak to Nuance specifically, but Abridge helps generate a care plan as well as the treatment recommendations from the provider and delivers that in a user-friendly way. And the goal there is to shorten the space between the visit and the patient sort of understanding what happened as a result of the visit. So they've got more visibility and transparency, a clearer record of what happened in that interaction, as well as giving them directly from the provider, this is the course of action for you. This is a treatment plan. This is what we expect. And the goal there is to, of course, increase adherence to what the provider is prescribed.
Yeah. Andy, you touched on a point there that is a recurring theme for us here at Method around healthcare is that kind of consumer experience. And our listeners will be able to enjoy more content from us on that front coming in the very near future. Gareth, there's another example that in kind of prep for this episode that we pulled out. Can talk a little bit about some synthetic data from a research perspective. You got a deep background there, and I think it really gets to the difference that we spoke about between just artificial intelligence versus generative AI that is actually creating a net new product.
Yeah, so as a major component of my PhD, I spent about 2 years generating synthetic data. This was an incredibly manual process. We had to get computational models that replicated blood flow. We had to get large amounts of statistical data on what should the distribution of arterial networks be across a normal population. And then we had to essentially sample thousands of arterial networks, solve these equations. I think we had supercomputers running for about 2 months to generate this. So it's a massive list that just makes it very infeasible outside of a case like a university where you can dedicate a year, 2 years to the pure pursuit of creating this synthetic data. Generative AI really allows that to become much more accessible, much more streamlined. It allows the removal of so much of that manual process and those really high computational components of that process. I've got pretty strong feelings about synthetic data. I think it's a great tool for really early exploration. There's so many nuances and caveats and restrictions around healthcare. So if we can generate this data really quickly, really non-inexpensively, it's going to empower better research, more research. It's going to allow us to push edge of envelope by just getting our hands on things which normally aren't accessible or would take a very long time to get to us.
I think really powerful deployments on both those examples. And I think a space that healthcare is in desperate need of advancement in some of these domains that I'm excited about how this is going to be deployed and watching some of the beneficial impacts. Again, for our listeners, my guests on the Inside Method podcast there, Andy Busam and Dr. Gareth Jones, who've written a great white paper on generative AI in healthcare that's available at method.com/insights. Specific to healthcare, right? We see AI being deployed across a number of different industries and fronts, but healthcare brings some really unique considerations and circumstances. We've talked about these kind of in prep around transparency and trust, generalizability, and then some of the regulatory components. Let's kind of maybe attack those in order. Andy, do you want to start, maybe talk about some of the transparency of how the AI engines are arriving at some of the content that they're creating and having transparency to that and why it's relevant even more so in healthcare than anywhere else?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what's unique in the healthcare context is that we are dealing with high risk situations in many cases, especially when we're talking about patient care. And so if we have an AI model deployed in an instance that's going to affect patient care, I think we have to be especially careful. And that's where the growing field of explainable AI, or XAI, you may see, is really coming in to play a strong role. And that's essentially another AI model that runs alongside the primary model that helps provide an explanation for how a recommendation or an output from the primary AI model came to be. And so there's a growing body of research into what are the best kinds of explainable AI models, what is the best user-friendly way of presenting that information, and that is going to be adopted well within the healthcare system. Yeah. And so I think it's especially important within, say, clinical decision support systems, right? So Microsoft's acquisition of OpenAI has given them the ability to integrate with Epic, which is another use case that we're seeing out in the marketplace. And so OpenAI is being deployed within some instances of Epic. They're running pilots currently, and primarily within clinical decision support systems, as a way of looking at all of the data that's coming into the EHR and generating a prescription recommendation or a treatment plan recommendation. And what I think is incredibly important for us as technologists, but certainly for health systems who are thinking about implementing these technologies, is if a recommendation is shown or a prescription is shown, that the provider can see it and say, okay, but how did the AI get to that recommendation? And so we've got to be able to show those explanations and show our thinking. So I think that we all probably heard that from a math teacher at some point.
Right.
It's not enough just to circle the answer at the bottom of the page, but I need to see how you got there, and that's still true in this space too.
Yeah. So as a pharmacist who made a large number of clinical recommendations to physicians over the years, the number of times that I had to kind of back up those recommendations, I mean, it's very much a real world scenario, and where you expect some of that in your human interaction, you're absolutely going to expect that in an artificial intelligence interaction, and maybe even more so. And we'll get into the generalizability there of, like, kind of, all right, where did this information come from? What data set was loaded into that AI engine? We'll get to that in a moment. Gareth, you talked earlier about the concept of trust. I saw an example, a deployment of AI earlier this week, where an AI engine is recreating QR codes. And instead of it just kind of being that ink blot with, square blocks on it, it's actually creating like beautiful pictures that is a QR code. And while that's a really kind of cute, neat deployment, artistic deployment of AI, the standards that we would accept there, from a trust perspective, or a cute TikTok video versus what we expect in healthcare are wildly different. Can you talk about some of the trust components relative to AI in healthcare?
Yeah, I think there's really two lenses of trust we got to think about, which is clinician and decision maker, and then also the patient trust. So from a patient, they need to know that they're getting the best treatment they can, that they're being looked after properly. And if that involves an algorithm, they need to know that it is capable of making a good decision or recommending a good decision. And then from clinician's perspective, it's balancing that control versus their accountability, right? Like, if at the end of the day, the buck stops at them at a decision, they need to know that anything that helps them get to that decision can be relied on. I would say from that, for me, a very important element is we should always aim to keep clinicians with a hand on the wheel. They should always feel in the loop. We should never try and remove them from it. As soon as we start doing that, it makes it a lot harder for them to trust it. Leaning into Andy's previous point of transparency, right? If they're just getting end of the line recommendations without any oversight into what's happening in the middle, trust becomes much, much harder. And so we really need to ensure people feel that they can rely on this, so we get good implementation and good utilization, right? If we have really good tools, but nobody uses it, we're not going to make an impact. So we need clinicians and we need patients to trust what we're building.
Yeah, I think there's also some really interesting behavioral psychology research within this space as well. There was a study published a few months ago out of the UK that essentially looked at explainable AI models, different forms of explainable AI models. So ways of explaining, here's how the AI got to its recommendation.
Yeah.
And one of the goals of the study was to see which way of explaining is most effective. And so there were some results of that, but the thing that was most compelling and interesting to me was merely showing that there was an explanation over time. Almost lulled the providers into believing it, regardless of the accuracy of the recommendation.
Wow.
So even if there was an explanation there, even if it wasn't a good one,
its presence alone was convincing.
Exactly. Wow. So I think that we have to consider a range of factors when we deploy these systems. We've got to think about, what is the workload of a provider, and as well as training and education for those providers on actually critically thinking about what is the information I'm seeing here.
Yeah.
Merely seeing an explanation doesn't mean that it's accurate.
Well, it's a perfect segue into the next topic there on generalizability, right? So when you think about AI engines, if an AI engine in a normal course of your life is pulling from Wikipedia, that may be really useful information. But we're talking about making like clinical decision support stuff for patient care, very much an unacceptable platform to pull that in. But these AI engines have to be leveraging some data asset to arrive at those conclusions. So talk more about the generalizability aspect there for us.
I may defer that one to Gareth.
All right, that's fair.
Yeah, I think it's really difficult. I know there's been cases where, for example, AI models trained in one country have had to be retrained when moving borders, just from basic differences in demographics, prolific health problems, etc. So when we get into generative AI, I think that becomes even more nuanced and even more complex, where we might be drawing a lot of different, very heavily contextualized data sets, right? Because when we think about things like text or images, there is a lot of context baked into that. And so we really need to think about what is the full utilization, where are we planning on using this, and is that actually captured within the data sets we can make available? And that can become very, very hard, because something clinicians are very good at doing is applying prior knowledge to new cases and taking what they know and using it in new and novel ways. And that is something that AI is always going to struggle to do, because it is replicating what it's previously seen. And so I think there's always going to be nuances and caveats. I think the best we can do is to make people aware of the limitations and not be naive to the fact that, hey, look, it's not going to work every case of the time, right? This is great at doing those really repetitive stuff that it's seen before, but if you bring in a really edge of the envelope case that you've never seen before, it's going to struggle, let alone yourself, right?
So we'd probably be negligent if we didn't, when we talk about specific considerations for healthcare with AI, if we didn't talk about some of the regulatory and privacy and security components, everything from PHI to HIPAA and certainly international privacy laws as well. Gareth, do you want to kind of touch on that one at the outset and talk about some specific things for healthcare and AI?
I think a big one for me I've heard concerns about before is this worry of essentially hallucinating personal private data, right? Like, these models learn by looking at previous data sets, by learning how to replicate that. The chances of it are incredibly low. However, we can't exclude the fact that generative AI might introduce data that it's seen previously that might be sensitive in the case of healthcare. So I think we have to be very nuanced. I think, again, this loops back to we need to have a human in the loop. It's a great way of reducing workload. However, we can never fully remove humans. And I think when we start to think about regulation, I think by ensuring we always have a human in the loop who is accountable and is checking this, I think we can alleviate a lot of regulatory concerns there.
Yeah. Andy, anything to add on that?
Totally agree with Gareth, and this space is evolving, right? So I think that we'll see, privacy advocates as well as government agencies sort of step into this space and offer perspectives and maybe even change some of the rules and guidelines within the space. I think this is one of the areas for synthetic data to really make a difference. And Syntegra is a company within the space that's generating these synthetic data sets, because they are it's essentially generated data based off of real patient data, but it's all synthetic at the end of the day. There are no real privacy concerns. So if you have a pharmaceutical company who's spinning up a clinical trial and they need a data set, being able to use a synthetic data set allows them to expedite through some of the regulatory and compliance considerations that they normally would be slowed down by using real patient data. So I think that's an area certainly that we'll see growth in.
So in your white paper that's available at method.com/insights, there's a number of perspectives that you pull out. One of my favorites it's kind of a theme throughout the course of the entire perspective paper is this notion of not being a hammer looking for a nail. When Method specifically talking about how we are engaged in helping our customers deploy AI and generative AI in healthcare. Maybe I'll come to you for this one first. Talk about some of that approach of how we, when a customer comes to us and say, we need an AI project, come fix this for us. How do we approach that here at Method?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, we are a human-centered design firm. And so we really start with people. One of our principles is to fall in love with the problem, not a solution. Yeah. So we don't walk into a room with a predetermined notion of you need this new technology. We're not here to sell a specific set of softwares, and we frankly sort of pride ourselves on the fact that we do spend time getting to know end users, customers, employees, providers, front office folks, caregivers, all the people who are going to be impacted by a potential digital product or service that we might deploy into the real world. And so we put humans first, and I think that doesn't change even with some of this new technology.
Yeah. So in some of those scenarios where the problem calls for AI as a solution, very eager and capable of being able to do that, but not deploying AI for AI's sake is not the way that we go about kind of solving that. Gareth, do you want to elaborate at all on kind of that human first, human centric element? I find that it's such a recurring theme throughout everything that you guys put in your perspective paper and in certain all of our ongoing conversations here at Method in the client work that we're doing.
Yeah, I think coming from a very academic background into a very user-centric business like Method, something I had to learn quite quickly is there is no inherent value in data, right? It's all about getting the right data to the right people at the right time in the right format. And sometimes generative AI is a great tool for doing that. However, it is only one tool we have in our arsenal, right? So we really do want to talk to users and stakeholders and understand. We quite often describe it as like their cognitive journey from you get some input or some data and you have to make a decision or do an action, and how do you go about that and what are the steps you take? And understanding where we can interject new tools or where we could interject new insights into that to alleviate any pain points they might have is kind of the first approach we do, and then we figure out what are the best solutions to do that. And as I say, I mean, if generative AI is the right way of doing that, it's an incredibly powerful tool in a lot of cases, but it's not without its caveats, as we've already discussed. And so if we could get away with something, for example, like basic statistical models, it may be not as powerful, but also alleviates a lot of concerns we have. And so we are very, very keen to find use cases where it's the right tool to use it, but we're also not afraid to suggest other options if they are more suitable.
Yeah. And Gareth, one other piece that I think that you might be able to speak to here is around the fact that generative AI is really it's a continuation of a broader data strategy that a company should have, right? So there are so many other decisions and building blocks that need to be put into place before generative AI can be a real solution for a company. And so I think that we also think about a data strategy and a data practice for an organization on a maturity scale. So would love your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I would say if your first step in a data strategy is generative AI, it's like learning to drive a Ferrari, right? Like you need that base, you need that groundwork in place before you can think about really trying to implement those big tools. And I would say that a lot of additional value can just be gained by pretty simple data strategy, data platforms, some really simple visualizations or basic business dashboards before you start thinking about trying to augment that, right? And just really simple automation, really simple centralization, all of those best practices, and then build onto that the more complex AI and generative AI packages that can come on top.
Mm-hmm.
Throughout the course of that perspective paper, you guys both, and you've alluded to it here in our conversation today too, alluded to the concept of AI really being a collaborative tool. When we talk about some of the administrative opportunities for deployment, we can, let AI kind of run and do some of those things. But when it comes to clinical deployments, really having it be more of a recommendation versus the AI itself making a clinical decision that's directly applied to patient care. And I think that's an important piece that's worth kind of calling out here. But the last piece that you guys had in your perspective was around in the work that we do, in the way that Method approaches AI in healthcare, is around validation and safety and efficacy, which is really, really close to home for healthcare. I'll kind of let you guys choose who wants to tackle that one first as kind of the last piece in your perspective paper.
Sure. I mean, I'll start just generally. Validation or user testing is a process for us, regardless of the nature of the project. Certainly within a healthcare context, I think it is potentially more complex because of the number of stakeholders and the potential risk or outcome of a product in the market. And so before we introduce any new technology, we certainly want to put that in the hands of real users. And we do our best to not have bias entering those conversations or observations, to watch how those products are being used. And that for us is incredibly important to make sure that the intent that we set out with making a solution is actually in line with what happens in the real world.
Gareth, anything to add on that one?
An ambition, I don't know if quite ambition is the right word, but I think we should be striving for clinicians spending 80% of their time doing those most impactful 20% of use cases or jobs, right? Really trying to take that mundane, low risk, tedious jobs away from them to allow them to do the most impactful, the most meaningful things they can do with their time. And I think AI and generative AI are a great way of trying to really shift that balance. I think at the minute it's in emergency care, 75% of the time is on administrative tasks, right? I think the first thing we need to do in that is to actually understand, okay, well, where are these low risk, where are these tedious jobs that we can remove and we can automate and we can use AI and generative AI, which comes down to a lot of validation. It's actually going and talking to people and understanding. And then as we supplement that into small groups of people's workload, actually seeing, are we having the intended impact? We don't want to then introduce extra workload because they're having to oversee or be involved with these new models, these new tools they've got into place. And so really these small scale tests of, are they trusting it? Are they understanding it? Is it actually removing workload? Is it having the impact we want? Are incredibly important before we think about rolling out anything at scale.
Excellent. Andy and Gareth, you guys have been excellent guests on this episode of the Inside Method podcast. I hope you both will come back soon. Again, for our listeners, method.com/insights to download the white paper and get to learn a lot more about what Andy and Gareth have put in terms of the perspective of AI in healthcare. I'm Scott Pope, Global Lead for Healthcare and Life Sciences at Method. Thank you for joining this episode.